There's a deep misunderstanding about what an empath's light truly is. People often describe it as kindness, warmth, or emotional sensitivity, and while those qualities are part of it, they only scratch the surface. At its essence, an empath's light is awareness. It's perception, the ability to see what exists without distortion, denial, or the protective layers of self-deception many people depend on to stay comfortable. And this is where the tension begins. Because when you carry that level of awareness, you don't just notice beauty, you also notice contradiction. You see when someone's words don't match their feelings. You catch the subtle changes in tone, the hesitation in speech, the emotional currents they try to hide. You sense what remains unresolved, what's buried, what's being avoided. And here's the key point: you don't need to say anything. You don't have to confront it. Your presence alone is enough. That's what people respond to. Most people spend much of their lives managing inner discomfort by avoiding it. They construct identities based on who they believe they are rather than who they truly are. They create stories that protect their ego, justify their actions, and keep deeper insecurities out of sight. This isn't always intentional. It's human. It's a psychological defense, but it comes at a price. It demands constant upkeep, ongoing denial, and repeated reinforcement. Now place an empath into that setting. An empath doesn't operate by those rules, not because they want to disrupt anything, but because they can't ignore what they perceive. Their awareness cuts through appearances. Their presence unsettles illusions, not forcefully or deliberately, but inevitably. And when someone who is heavily invested in their self-image encounters that kind of clarity, discomfort arises. They feel exposed, not in the sense that their secrets are openly revealed, but internally. It's the sense that someone sees more than what's being shown, that they understand something you haven't fully admitted to yourself. For many, that feeling is deeply unsettling. This is where it becomes psychologically intriguing. Most people don't respond to that discomfort with curiosity. They don't ask themselves, why do I feel so seen? Or what am I avoiding within myself? Instead, they project it outward. They search for something external to blame for their unease, and the easiest target becomes the empath. What starts as quiet recognition can turn into subtle resistance. It may appear as dismissiveness, passive-aggressive remarks, or an unexpected shift in attitude that feels disproportionate to anything you've done. From the empath's perspective, it can be confusing because there was no argument, no confrontation, no clear trigger. But the trigger was never external, it was internal. Your presence challenged something they weren't ready to face. This is where resentment begins to form, not loudly, but quietly and persistently. It grows beneath the surface, disguised as indifference, sarcasm, or forced politeness. Underneath, it lies a specific psychological pattern. You reflect a level of honesty they are not living in alignment with. People don't resent what goes unnoticed. They resent what reminds them. What makes this even more complex is that empaths often try to compensate for this tension. They sense the discomfort even if they don't fully understand it and attempt to soften their presence. They become more agreeable, more accommodating, more cautious with their words. They dim their awareness in an effort to make others feel at ease, but that doesn't resolve the issue. Because the problem was never about what you said or did, it was about what you represent. You can't negotiate with someone's inner conflict, nor can you carry their discomfort for them. The more you shrink yourself to avoid triggering it, the more you reinforce a pattern where your clarity feels like something you must hide. That isn't sustainable. On a deeper level, what's happening is both philosophical and psychological. Your light isn't only about emotional sensitivity, it's about alignment with truth. And truth has a distinct quality. It doesn't need force to disrupt. It simply exists, and by doing so, it challenges anything that isn't aligned with it. So when someone reacts negatively to your presence, it isn't always because you've done something wrong. Often, it reflects something they're not ready to see clearly. This realization is crucial. Their resentment isn't a rejection of your worth. It's a reaction to their own inner conflict. Once you understand that, your role shifts. You stop trying to fix their reaction and start recognizing the pattern. You stop internalizing their discomfort and begin observing it with clarity. You come to see that being labeled as too much, too intense, or too aware is often just another way of describing a level of perception that challenges the norm, and not everyone is ready for that. The goal then isn't to reduce your awareness or dilute your presence. It's to understand the responsibility that comes with it, to know when to engage, when to step back, and when to accept that not every space or person can meet you at that level. Because light doesn't only highlight what's beautiful, it also exposes what's hidden. And not everyone resents the light for what it is. Some resent it for what it reveals. If you look closely, you'll notice a pattern. Empaths don't just attract connection, they attract need. And there's a difference between the two that often goes unnoticed until it becomes a problem. Connection is mutual, rooted in respect, reciprocity, and awareness. Need, by contrast, is one-sided. It seeks comfort, validation, and emotional support. And empaths, by their nature, tend to become visible to those operating from that place of need. This isn't random, it's structural. Empaths usually listen more than they speak. They observe more than they interrupt. They validate more than they challenge, especially in the beginning. These qualities signal psychological safety. To a well-balanced person, that sense of safety feels like trust. But to someone who is emotionally immature or internally unstable, that same safety feels like access. And access is where the dynamic begins to change. Because when someone realizes they can be understood without fully understanding themselves, they start leaning on that external source. They begin to unload. They bring their confusion, frustration, and unresolved emotions, and the empath almost naturally absorbs it. Not out of duty, but out of inherent. There's a built-in tendency to help organize what's unclear, to create understanding, to calm emotional disorder. At first, this can feel meaningful. It feels purposeful, like you're making a real impact in someone's life. And in many ways, you are. But what often goes unnoticed is the imbalance. The exchange isn't equal. One person is offering energy, attention, and insight, while the other is consuming it. In a healthy dynamic, this imbalance would eventually correct itself. There would be movement toward mutuality. The other person would grow in awareness, take responsibility, and begin contributing emotionally in return. But in unhealthy dynamics, the opposite unfolds. The more you give, the more they take. And the more they take, the more they begin to depend on you, not as a person, but as a resource. That's when something subtle yet significant happens. Dependence starts to turn into entitlement. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once received with gratitude turns into something they feel owed. And when you inevitably can't meet that expectation because no 1.9 can sustain that level of output forever, the emotional tone shifts. This is where resentment starts to form, and it's often the most confusing part for empaths. From your perspective, nothing negative was introduced. You were supportive, patient, and present. So when the other person becomes distant, critical, or even hostile, it feels disproportionate, like a shift that appeared out of nowhere. But it didn't. It grew from a psychological imbalance that had been building over time. The other person didn't just value what you gave, they began comparing themselves to it. And that comparison is uncomfortable because your ability to process emotions remains steady and offer clarity highlights a gap in their own capacity. Instead of using that awareness as motivation to grow, many people respond by reframing the situation. They begin to view your strengths not as admirable, but as threatening. Your consistency becomes too much. Your insight becomes overanalyzing. Your emotional depth becomes intensity. These labels aren't accurate. They're defensive. They serve to reduce the discomfort of recognizing something in you that they haven't yet developed within themselves. And when that discomfort intensifies, it gets redirected outward toward you. So the very qualities that once drew them in become the source of irritation. Not because those qualities changed, but because their relationship to them did. What once felt supportive now feels exposing. What once felt stabilizing now feels confronting. And here's the part that requires a level of clarity many empaths initially struggled to accept. Some people aren't drawn to you because they value who you are. They're drawn to you because they value what you provide. There's a functional difference between being appreciated and being used, and it often only becomes clear over time. This doesn't mean everyone who enters your life has harmful intent. In many cases, it's unconscious. People operate through patterns they don't fully understand. They seek relief wherever they can find it, and when they encounter someone who offers emotional clarity, they attach to it. But unconscious behavior, if you're not aware of the pattern, you can spend a great deal of time overextending yourself, trying to maintain a dynamic that was never meant to be sustainable. You give more, hoping it will restore balance. You explain more, hoping it will create understanding. But the underlying structure doesn't change because it was built on extraction, not exchange. So the question becomes, what do you do with that awareness? First, stop confusing constant need with deep connection. They are not the same. Depth is defined by mutual investment, not by how much someone depends on you. Second, begin observing how people respond when access is limited, not removed entirely, just limited. Do they become more respectful, more self-aware, or do they become frustrated, distant, or dismissive? That reaction reveals everything about the nature of the dynamic. Finally, recalibrate your role. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotional states. You are not obligated to be a constant source of clarity in someone else's confusion. Your ability to understand others is a strength, but it's not a resource meant to exist without boundaries. Because when giving becomes your identity, you attract those who are looking to take. And if you don't define the limits of that exchange, someone else will. The goal isn't to stop being empathetic, it's to become intentional with it. To recognize where it's valued, where it's respected, and where it's simply consumed. Because the moment you mistake being needed for being respected, you step into a dynamic where your worth is no longer defined by who you are, but by how much of yourself you're willing to give away. And that isn't connection, it's depletion. There comes a moment that nearly every empath experiences, and it usually arrives quietly. It isn't dramatic or clearly marked. It begins as a subtle internal realization that something about the way you've been relating to others is no longer sustainable. You start to see the imbalance more clearly. You feel the weight of always being available. You recognize that your willingness to understand others hasn't always been matched by their willingness to understand you. And from that awareness, something begins to shift. You begin setting boundaries, not as punishment and not out of anger, but from a place of clarity. You start saying no where you once said yes. You pause instead of responding instantly. You question dynamics you previously accepted without thinking. And most importantly, you stop overextending yourself in situations where your energy isn't respected. From your perspective, this shift feels steady, it feels necessary, it feels like a correction. But to someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries, it feels very different. It feels like loss. And loss, especially when it isn't understood, often turns into resistance. This is where the psychological tension becomes clear. Boundaries don't just restrict behavior, they redefine relationships, they change the terms of interaction. They introduce structure where there was once unlimited access. And for someone who has grown used to that access, the introduction of limits can feel sudden, even when it's completely reasonable. Here's the important part. People don't react to boundaries based on what they are, but on what they remove. If someone was used to having unrestricted access to your time, attention, patience, and emotional support, then even a small boundary can feel significant. Not because it's unfair, but because it disrupts a pattern they depended on. And when that pattern is interrupted, it forces them to adjust. But not everyone adjusts through awareness. Some respond with defensiveness. They begin to reinterpret your behavior. What once felt like kindness is now labeled inconsistency. What was once appreciated is now questioned. You might hear things like, "You've changed," or "You're not the same anymore," or subtler comments that imply distance or withdrawal. And in a literal sense, they're right. You have changed, but not in the way they mean. You haven't become colder. You've become more intentional. You haven't withdrawn a care. You've redefined how it's given. You haven't lost empathy. You've become more selective about where it goes. The problem is that this distinction isn't always visible to them. From their perspective, the change is measured by access, and when access decreases, it feels like rejection. That's when insecurity begins to surface, because boundaries don't just limit interaction, they introduce accountability. They require the other person to take a more active role in managing their own emotions, expectations, and behavior. And for someone who isn't used to that responsibility, it can feel uncomfortable. So instead of adjusting internally, they try to restore the old dynamic externally. They push against the boundary. Sometimes it's direct, they question it, challenge it, or try to negotiate around it. Other times it's subtle. They test it, seeing if you'll fall back into old patterns under pressure. And in some cases, when those efforts fail, the response becomes emotional. Frustration turns into criticism, discomfort turns into distance, and your clarity becomes the target. This is where many empaths experience internal conflict. You can feel the shift in the other person, the tension, the resistance, the change in tone. And part of you wants to restore harmony, to explain more, to soften the boundary, to make things feel comfortable again. But that instinct, while natural, comes with a cost. Every time you weaken a boundary to protect someone else's comfort, you reinforce a dynamic where your needs come second. You send a message to them and to yourself that your limits are negotiable under pressure. And once that pattern forms, it becomes harder to maintain consistency. So the real challenge isn't setting boundaries, it's holding them. And holding them requires a different kind of strength than most people expect. It isn't loud or forceful, it's quiet and steady. It's the ability to sit with someone else's discomfort without trying to fix it. It's the willingness to let them have their reaction without taking responsibility for it. That's where the shift happens. Because when you stop managing how others feel about your boundaries, you allow the true nature of the relationship to reveal itself. People who respect you will adapt. They may not like the change at first, but they'll recognize its validity. They'll meet you with understanding that reflects their own stability. But those who were benefiting from your lack of boundaries will struggle, not because the boundary is unreasonable, but because it takes away something they weren't prepared to lose. And in that struggle, their behavior becomes more transparent. The frustration, the resentment, the subtle attempts to regain control, it all becomes visible. And that visibility isn't a problem, it's information. It shows you who was connected to you and who was connected to your availability. Once you see that clearly, your choices become more grounded. You stop trying to maintain every relationship at the same level. You stop over-explaining your limits. You stop compromising your well-being just to preserve dynamics that were never balanced. Because boundaries aren't about creating distance, they're about defining where you end and someone else begins. And the people who feel unsettled by that definition are often the ones who benefited from its absence. If there's one thing to understand, it's this: when your boundaries trigger someone, they aren't reacting to your limits, they're reacting to the loss of control those limits create. And that reaction isn't a sign that you've done something wrong. In fact, the moment your no begins to disrupt someone else's expectations is the moment you stop living according to them. That's where real self-respect begins. There's one final layer to this dynamic that only becomes clear after you've already started to change. It's not about what you give, and it's not even about the boundaries you set. It's about what happens when you begin to grow internally, quietly, steadily, and in ways that fundamentally reshape how you see yourself and the world around you. Growth, in its most genuine form, is disruptive, not outwardly, not in a way that seeks attention, but internally. It reshapes your standards, it shifts your tolerance, it recalibrates what feels aligned and what doesn't. For an empath, this kind of growth often comes from accumulated experience. You've observed enough patterns. You felt enough imbalance. You reach a point where awareness is no longer optional. It becomes integrated. And once that integration takes place, you no longer relate to people in the same way. You become more selective, not out of judgment, but from clarity. You listen differently. You respond differently. You no longer feel the same urgency to fix, to explain, or to carry emotional weight that isn't yours. There's a shift from participation to observation, from reaction to intention. From within, this feels like alignment. But from the outside, especially to those who haven't gone through a similar process, it can feel like distance. And this is where the tension deepens. Your growth doesn't exist in isolation, it exists in contrast. It highlights differences in awareness, responsibility, and emotional maturity. For someone who has remained in the same patterns, that contrast can be hard to ignore. It creates a kind of silent comparison, not one you initiate or even acknowledge, but one they feel. They notice the shift in how you behave. They recognize that you no longer engage in the same ways. The conversations feel different. The energy feels different. The level of access changes. And whether they express it or not, they begin to measure that difference. For someone open to growth, this can be motivating. It can prompt reflection. They may start asking themselves deeper questions. They may feel inspired to evolve, to close that gap, to meet you at a new level of awareness. But not everyone responds this way. For some, that contrast doesn't inspire, it threatens, because growth requires confrontation. It asks you to face what hasn't been addressed, what remains unresolved, what hasn't been developed. And for someone who isn't ready for that process, your evolution becomes a reminder of their stagnation. And reminders, especially the ones we didn't choose, often create resistance. So instead of moving toward growth, they move toward reinterpretation. They begin reframing your change in a way that protects their current position. You're seen as distant, detached, or even arrogant. Your calm is labeled indifference. Your clarity becomes rigidity. Your silence is taken as judgment. These interpretations aren't objective, they're defensive.